Most single-player action games are updated for a brief period post-launch and then left alone. Not so with Dying Light, which has been updated with 4 major expansion packs, countless downloadable accessories, and a steady stream of fixes since its release in early 2015. Still, its most recent update is rather extraordinary. 7 years after launch, Dying Light has been refreshed with support for current-gen consoles, as well as the last-gen enhanced machines. Techland promises big boosts to framerate and resolution here, courtesy of multiple user-selectable graphics modes. This is just a patch. We're not getting bespoke current-gen versions, though with doubled framerate targets and quadrupled resolutions, perhaps this is the next best thing. Dying Light was an impressive-looking title at release. It leveraged the then-new Xbox One and PS4 hardware, and made a pioneering use of techniques like global illumination to achieve a well-realized open world. Foliage was a particular highlight. Dying Light was overflowing with dense, high-detail foliage with accurate self-shadows and intricate animation. Still, not everything was quite up to snuff. Geometric and texture detail could look a bit plain when subjected to point-blank scrutiny, and character modeling was a few years behind the curve, but on the whole it was a very attractive effort. However, Dying Light was never updated for the PS4 Pro or Xbox One X, and its SMAA T2X anti-aliasing made the game shimmer and pop in motion and came saddled with ghosting artifacts. Enter the new Dying Light patch, which dropped in early March on PlayStation and earlier this week on Xbox. Improvements to resolution should iron out image quality concerns, while framerate boosts ought to improve fluidity and diminish ghosting. So what's on offer? There are 5 modes here, split across 2 tiers of console performance. PS5 and Series X get a high performance 1080p 60 mode, a balanced 1440p 60 mode, and a high resolution 2160p 30 mode. Series S and Xbox One X get high performance and high resolution modes too, but these come in at just 1080p 30 and 1440p 30. There's no 60fps modes to speak of. PS4 Pro? Well, it's basically been left out. It sticks to the 1080p 30 target of the original PS4 release, albeit with claims of an improved 30fps cap. We'll touch on this one later, but suffice to say it's not clear what, if anything, has been changed. These modes showcase the expected spread in image quality. The 1080p modes have very similar clarity and temporal stability when measured against the PS4 release. It's a somewhat raw-looking 1080p image, without the blur associated with FXAA, nor the frame-to-frame consistency of advanced modern TAA techniques. We do get some image treatment courtesy of the SMAA, but it doesn't offer a particularly clean output. The 1440p modes show a moderate but appreciated bump over the original presentation. We're getting a 78% boost to raw resolution here over the PS4 version, which does reduce the appearance of aliasing substantially, as well as delivering a clear rendition of fine details on foliage and distant buildings. Even with close to twice the pixel count, however, shimmer is still an annoyance as you move the camera. Series X and PS5 get the option to push all the way to 4K in their high resolution modes, however, and this is where Dying Light looks properly modern. 2160p offers enough pixels for SMAA T2X to clean up the image without much noticeable aliasing on fine details. Foliage looks razor sharp, and far-off objects are resolved with clinical clarity. The combination of a light touch approach to AA plus a very high native resolution produces a detailed output that we don't typically see in modern high-budget console titles. In addition to these improvements, the 60fps modes available on PS5 and Series X mostly fix the ghosting issues present in the other versions. The SMAA T2X used in Dying Light includes SMAA, which is a post-process anti-aliasing technique, alongside a temporal component that uses multiple frames to assist with edge sampling. This doesn't closely resemble most modern TAA techniques though, so image stability isn't dramatically improved over standard post-process AA. Unfortunately, this was accompanied by quite a bit of temporal ghosting in the original release, ghosting that is still present to some degree in the 30fps modes across current and last-gen systems. The 60fps modes cut the time between the sampled frames in half, and so shrink the ghosting artifacts considerably. If you look very closely, they're still noticeable, but during gameplay they essentially disappear. Veterans of gaming forums at the time of Dying Light's release will be familiar with a particularly heated controversy: the console version's lower than low view distance setting. This setting controlled the draw distance for high detail geometry and crucially LOD levels for Dying Light's brilliant looking foliage. PS4 and Xbox One used a setting lower than the PC's low setting, which meant that the PC version had much more distant detail when pushed to its limits, although this came at a massive performance penalty. Despite the fact that draw distances on console still looked perfectly reasonable and LOD transitions were well handled, the idea that they fell below a setting labeled low on PC was greeted with derision in some circles. Presumably these new versions might be a good opportunity to clear this up, as well as address other settings deficits relative to the maxed out PC release. Unfortunately, there are no significant differences in underlying visual settings that I could see, comparing across 10 sample shots. The only visual settings that appear to change outside of resolution are depth of field and ambient occlusion, both of which become less extensively applied as resolution increases. These effects scale based on rendering resolution, which means that at 1440p and 4K, there's a progressive decline in the size of AO coverage and in the distortion of the depth of field effect. The subtler AO at high resolutions is more subjectively appealing to me, and I prefer the shallower depth of field available at lower resolutions, but your preferences may vary. There is one oddity worth mentioning here though. Dying Light has an excellent motion blur implementation on last-gen consoles, as well as on most of the new modes available in this patch. However, the high-resolution 4K 30 mode on Series X and PS5 seems to greatly reduce the intensity of this effect, compromising motion fluidity. This seems to be related to rendering resolution as well, as the 1440p modes see a substantial, though smaller, reduction in motion blur intensity relative to the 1080p modes. Dying Light's other major vice outside of image quality was performance. The PS4 ran with a reasonably good framerate at launch for the most part, but it had a double buffer VSync setup alongside an unlocked framerate that meant that less intense scenes could produce a smattering of 16.7 millisecond frames, raising the framerate above 30 FPS but producing brutal judder. The Xbox One had a better implemented 30 FPS cap, but suffered from more frequent performance drops. There's good news on this front, even on the base last-gen machines. The PS4 version was updated at some point recently to feature a proper 30 FPS cap, and Xbox One performance was improved substantially in the years after the game launched. Both systems now turn in relatively stable performance, with issues only in intense scenes. Explosions and fire can lead to brief dips down to the mid-20s, but aside from that, we're looking at a locked 30 FPS across the two consoles. On the enhanced and current gen machines, frame rates are even more stable. I tested in a variety of circumstances, including in several endgame saves, and it was very challenging to get the new versions to dip at all. Even intense combat with guns, explosions, and fire wouldn't do the trick. I couldn't get the game to drop a single frame on any of the enhanced machines, except in one circumstance. With a lot of enemy NPCs on screen, as well as fire and smoke effects in this specific spot, I was able to get most versions of the game to briefly drop frames in their 1440p modes. PS5, Series X, Series S, and One X all drop frames here when running at 1440p 30 or 1440p 60. The 4K 30 modes on PS5 and Series X don't have any issues here, nor any of the 1080p modes on any of the current gen or enhanced last gen consoles. Even though I did manage to log some rather large dips in this one instance, this doesn't seem at all representative of typical gameplay. Every other stress test scenario I tried held to the framerate target. So what mode should you play? Firstly, the 1080p high performance modes on Series X, S, One X, and PS5 should be avoided. Image quality really suffers here, and there's minimal performance differences between these modes and the 1440p modes that are also available on those consoles, whether they happen to run at 30 FPS or 60 FPS. Their inclusion is a bit confusing, and more worryingly, they are the default rendering choice, so less savvy users are likely to stick with these visually degraded modes. That means that on Series S and One X, the high resolution mode, which offers a 1440p 30 update, is the clear winner. Image quality is substantially improved here, and you get a tangible upgrade over last-gen consoles on these machines. Both the 1440p 60 balanced and 4K 30 high resolution modes on PS5 and Series X have their merits. It's a classic trade-off between motion fluidity and image quality, although complicated a little bit by the scaled back motion blur on the 4K 30 modes. My general preference here is to opt for the balanced modes, which deliver a good looking image at double the frame rate of the original console release. Dying Light is simply a smoother, more pleasing experience to play at 60 FPS. If you're willing to deal with a choppier output, the high resolution modes do deliver a rather striking 4K image on these consoles though, with razor sharp detail. Techland's continued devotion to Dying Light is worth commending. Despite its 2015 vintage, they have been diligently updating the title, with the last major DLC content arriving in 2020 and new items added to the game just 3 months ago. While this update is largely a set of resolution and frame rate tweaks, it's still a welcome upgrade. Series X and PS5 have options that hugely improve image quality and playability, while Series S and 1X at least get a sizable resolution bump. But in common with Dying Light 2, Techland has made some odd graphics mode choices. Putting the 1080p modes as the default on current-gen consoles and 1X is a perplexing move, as is the absence of a 60 FPS mode on Series S, which really should be more than powerful enough to manage. Still, this is a great excuse to revisit the world of Dying Light 1, and a good opportunity for series newcomers to take the plunge. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. To view a high-quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfinder.net, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. That's all from me for now. Thanks for watching.